I'm Mark Raymond from Open Road Consulting. I want to talk to you about a particular approach for high-performing teams called the Promises approach. This is a key part of human-centered work, which focuses on how teams coordinate with one another to get stuff done, build relationships, and learn together. I'm a massive fan of this approach because I've seen teams benefit, including high-performing teams, benefit from improving communication that results in them providing more value and satisfaction for others in a lot less time with less stress. And I've also seen teams benefit from using this to identify where the issues lie and fix them in really constructive ways. I'll provide an example of this a little bit later. The other thing I think that is important about this is that many people get an immense sense of joy and satisfaction from providing value and satisfaction and delivering on the expectations to others, using their expertise and experience, knowledge and relationships to do that. And this approach helps facilitate that. This approach is based on 4 key principles. The first is that when we're doing work, we are either doing it for someone else, could be an external customer or someone else in the business, or we are waiting on work from someone else. So we're either in a customer role, that could be in a traditional sense of an external paying customer, or it could be an internal customer, managers are customers in different situations. We're in that role, or we're in a performer role doing work for someone else. Regardless of the role, when we're working with others, there are always conditions of satisfaction that we both have. Conditions of satisfaction or expectations of the quality of work to be delivered, the level of support, the types of conversations we will have with one another. Often those expectations are unspoken, and those expectations go both ways. The third thing is that performers often are juggling multiple balls. Performers will have time constraints that needs to be factored in. And lastly, the name of the game is really about what's less about performers perfecting tasks according to their own standards. It's using their expertise, skills and knowledge and communication to deliver work in a way that meets or exceeds the expectations of customers. And that can often lead to doing less unnecessary work. It's called the Promises approach because when you think about it, when you're at work and you have expectations of what others are going to deliver, and those expectations aren't met, you can feel let down, disappointed, frustrated, like someone's broken a promise. And we call it the Promises approach because that's what teams are. They're about groups of people who are making and managing promises for each other and also for external customers. So we use that term deliberately. Before I get more into the detail, I'd invite you to think of a project that you're working on that's not going as well as you would like. And as you're listening to this presentation, it might be that you can identify some things that you can do to address some of those issues. The promise cycle happens over 4 phases. In this diagram, you'll see a customer on the left and the performer on the right, like we had before. The 4 phases, or quadrants as we call them, are prepare. So if I'm a manager and I'm playing the role of a customer, I want someone to do some work for me. Let's say I want someone to write a report. I'll think about who can I ask, what do I need in the report, and so on, and I will make a request. Promises only come about when someone makes a request or an offer. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll be focusing on the former, the requests that people make. So I make a request of someone in another department. Now we move into quadrant 2, where the person in the other department, called the performer in this case, will read or listen to the request, will think about what they can do, what they can't do. They may suggest alternatives, and then they'll come back to me and there'll be an agreement. Once there's an agreement or a promise, we move into quadrant 3, which is the delivery phase, which is where the performer goes and writes the report. Once they've done that, they may email it back to me. Once that happens, it moves into quadrant 4. So the work is done from their perspective at the end of quadrant 3. Quadrant 4 is also an important step for both parties because that is a closing of the loop. It's where the customer says, thank you, appreciate what you did, and the performer knows that their work has been acknowledged and it's complete. That's the cycle. Sounds very straightforward, but in reality, it can be more complicated than that. In our experience, let's say you're in a team of 10 and each person in the team is making 20 requests a day. So in our experience, in doing this for more than 10 years, requests are actioned to the satisfaction of both parties between 50% and 75% of the time. We'll just assume 2/3 of the time for the purposes of this. That means that you have 48,000 requests, which comes from multiplying 10 people times 20 times 5 days in a week times 48 weeks in a year that are being made. 16,000 of those are having to be chased, followed up, redone, and so on, with all of the time, frustration, extra work, in some cases, deterioration of relationships and so on that arises as a consequence of that. And for a company or a division with 100 people, that number becomes 160,000. The term we use to describe that is coordination waste. And a lot of that can be reduced by having different types of conversations, which we'll go through with you. An example of a project that I was involved in where some of this was occurring was with a large company where the company had different departments who were working together, teams in one department and teams in another department. And some of the issues were these. There was some friction between departments, which often happens in medium and larger organisations, where there can be silos that can operate, where there can be generalisations made about people if they're from that department or this department, which are often unhelpful. And they were constantly chasing up on requests that were being made and not delivered on. And in some instances, they were escalating requests that weren't being delivered on. So, and that was causing some more friction because people in other departments were feeling like they weren't being trusted. People were complaining about not feeling empowered or trusted. There was a feeling that people were being micromanaged, and that was leading them to lack confidence, to second guess themselves. It was also causing lots of waste where people were going from quadrant 3 to the delivery phase back into quadrant 2 where they were renegotiating work and checking, often unnecessarily because they were unclear about how much authority they had, what decisions they could make, and so on. There was increasing fatigue. This team were working extraordinarily long hours and delivering great results over a long time, but they were getting tired. They weren't feeling appreciated and valued. And for them, it felt a lot like Groundhog Day. And as a contributor to that, they were feeling like they weren't able to have much of a say. They weren't feeling empowered, which also contributed to the fatigue. One person described their culture as being very compliant. That might sound good. In practice, it's not so good because that meant that many requests that were being made of people were agreed to, because there was a feeling like people couldn't respond to requests with options other than yes. And many of those requests, in their assessment, they weren't workable. They weren't going to address the real problems. So there was lots of time being spent doing a lot of work in the delivery phase on projects that weren't going to solve the underlying problem. There was also a high level of staff turnover because they weren't feeling appreciated and empowered, and some subtle conflict, which is pretty common in teams, complaining about people rather than to them. And lastly, which is very common, there were lots of meetings. Some of those were really productive, many weren't. In terms of the strategies they undertook, we worked with them over a period of 18 months where they developed skills in coordinating together. And many of the things that they did had a big impact. Here's some. In quadrant 1, they started to prioritise cross-departmental relationships. They invested in those relationships. Rather than thinking of people in different departments by the departmental name, they started calling them by their individual name. So they weren't making these generalizations about people, but they invested time to get to know them and them. they started making more effective requests, because what they realized was some of their requests, or most of them, were done on email. Not many were face-to-face. So they started making more verbal requests where they may pick up the phone or go and talk to people. And in their requests, they were more conscious of providing timelines. They were providing greater context. So performers could understand a lot more about what they needed and were more able to provide alternative solutions. In quadrant 2, there was an agreement to a consistent set of behaviours. They developed a charter because they were finding that people were behaving in ways that were inappropriate, and they wanted to have a reset there. So they did that themselves, and they made agreements about that. And that helped provide a baseline for them. And it became easy for the managers to manage their team because there was an agreement about those. They started declining requests. And this is unusual for many teams where they feel like they can't say no to work, but for some meetings, they started declining and not going to, because there was often a duplication of people attending. And there was a greater sense of performers making counter offers and making suggestions on requests that were coming through, rather than just agreeing to do what the request said. And this was important because people in other departments often had expertise that they didn't have. So they would know a lot about what would be needed, and they would listen. And as a consequence of that, the solutions were better and the relationships were stronger. In the delivery phase, they got much better at communicating surprises. So when they would work on projects and tasks, inevitably what was needed was different to what they agreed to. There's usually surprises. There's usually things that hadn't been thought of in quadrant 2. So they got much better about communicating those to customers and making agreements and involving customers in those decisions. So there were no surprises, and also the solutions were going to meet the expectations of customers, not just do what they thought was a good idea. Quadrant 4, they had a very high performing culture and a focus on improvement. And that, as a consequence, meant that they were good at providing feedback about areas to improve, things that weren't working, but they weren't so good about providing feedback on what was working well. So they really doubled down on that and invested more time in doing that. And that led people to feel more appreciated and acknowledged. That increased retention, but it also helped them to really focus on strengths without not addressing what needed improvement, but there was a greater rebalancing there. There was more candor with other departments. So when there were issues around coordination, they'd be much more comfortable to express their views and listen to the views of other departments, not in a confrontational way, just a matter-of-fact way, but they wouldn't let those things slide. So that was really good for the relationship and for coordination. And related to that, they were much better at accountability conversations regarding behaviours. So all of those things had a few impacts. One, they became a lot more productive. They saved a lot of time. Between 10 and 20% of their time was being saved, and which meant they could do more productive things with that time. So a 10 to 20% productivity improvement. The relationships were much better. At the end of the project, many people said to us their relationships had never been stronger and they'd never been happier at work. The performance continued to improve. That was never a big issue before, but it continued to keep improving as it was before. And lastly, their retention of good people increased. They were losing people before, but because people were feeling appreciated, they were being developed more, and they were clearer about what was expected of them, retention went a lot higher. So that was some of the impacts. So back to your particular example, what does this mean for you in terms of the project that you thought of before? Can you identify the missing conversations? And secondly, where do you see scope to improve doing awesome work for your customers and in supporting your team? If you have any questions, please reach out. You can go to my website, openroadconsulting.com.au, and there are contact details there. Thank you.